She had always sat in the third row, second seat from the window, the one that didn't squeak when you shifted your weight. Not because she liked it, but because it gave her the best angle to hide behind her notebook when the snickers started. The whispers didn't come from just one direction. They came from every corner of the classroom. "Weird," they called her, as if curiosity was a crime and intelligence a defect. Her braids were too tight, her questions too many, and her lunch too different. But she never let them see the way it stung. She just kept her head down and kept calculating. While others scrolled through their phones under their desks, she memorized planetary orbits. While her peers giggled at viral dances, she diagrammed propulsion systems in the margins of her tests. No one was watching her when she submitted the application. Not the teacher who barely remembered her name, not the classmates who rolled their eyes at every hand she raised. No one saw her mail it. But someone, somewhere at NASA, did. And when the letter came back with the bold header she thought only existed in her dreams, her hands trembled. Not from fear, from recognition. She was no longer just the girl with strange ideas in a place that didn't understand her. Now, they would all know her name, because NASA already did. The third row, second seat from the left, had become her quiet refuge, not because it was comfortable, far from it. The chair wobbled slightly, and the desk had a scratch across its surface that resembled the orbit of Saturn she'd once seen in a textbook. But it offered the precise position she needed. Not too close to the front to attract attention, not so far back that the whispers and laughter became unbearable. It was a place of invisibility, and for a girl like her, who preferred the company of stars and circuits to the buzzing noise of adolescent judgment, that was everything. She arrived early every morning, earlier than anyone else in her grade. It wasn't because she was overly eager. It was because the first few minutes before the bell rang were the only moments of true peace. Her steps echoed through the half-lit hallway as she moved past faded posters of school pride and motivational quotes. No one greeted her, no one waved. But she didn't mind. She wasn't there for them. Her bag was heavier than it looked, packed not with cosmetics or phones like the others, but with science journals, loose-leaf paper filled with calculations, and a small circuit board she had been quietly building at home. When she sat down, she didn't pull out her phone to scroll through social media or snap a selfie. She opened a tattered notebook and began writing equations, sometimes humming softly under her breath. It wasn't a song anyone would recognize, just a tune she made up while thinking through physics problems. The teacher, Mr. Delaney, barely glanced at her when he entered the room. He had long since given up calling on her, not because she didn't know the answers, but because her answers made the others uncomfortable. Too detailed. Too advanced. Once, she corrected him on a chemistry equation in front of the class. He hadn't asked her to stay after, but she noticed the way he stopped looking her in the eye after that. The other students had their own unspoken system. She was the weird girl, the space kid, the silent one. No one ever said these things to her face, but she could read them in the way their conversations halted when she approached, or how they laughed just loud enough when she walked by. She didn't wear name brands. Her backpack was faded. Her sneakers were plain. Her hair was always tied back tightly, more functional than fashionable. Nothing about her presence said she belonged to the world they valued. But while they gossiped and swapped weekend plans, she was thinking about Europa's icy surface and whether microbial life could really survive beneath it. She wasn't dreaming of being liked. She was dreaming of stars. She hadn't always been like this. There was a time, early on, when she had tried to fit in. She wore brighter clothes, laughed at jokes she didn't understand, even faked interest in reality TV just to have something to say at lunch. But that ended the day her science fair project, a fully functioning robotic arm made of scrap metal and coated with homemade software, was dismissed as too complicated by a panel of judges who favored glittery volcanoes and poster boards covered in glitter glue. That was when she began to shrink inward, not with shame, but with precision. She pulled her curiosity inward like a collapsed star, dense and burning. She stopped raising her hand unless she knew the teacher didn't have a better option. She stopped volunteering to present, though her work was immaculate. She stopped trying to make her excitement for the universe fit into rooms too small to hold it. The third row became her observatory. From there, she observed human behavior like a scientist might watch fruit flies in a jar. Every whisper, every group dynamic, every time someone borrowed notes from a classmate only to laugh about them later. She took mental notes, not out of bitterness, but fascination. Why were people so afraid of different? Why did intelligence threaten them? Why did the loudest voices always seem the least informed? Her home life was quieter, but no less demanding. Her mother worked double shifts, and her older brother had moved out the moment he turned 18, leaving behind a trail of half-broken promises and forgotten birthdays. The girl was responsible for her own meals, her own homework, and often her own encouragement. There were no pep talks, no one checked her grades, but still, she excelled, not for applause, not for reward, simply because knowledge was her fuel, her escape, her form of resistance. She had a small telescope in her room, second-hand and chipped but functional. At night, she aimed it at the sky through a crack in the curtains, mapping constellations and logging lunar phases in a spiral notebook. It was the same notebook she carried to class, the one no one ever asked about. If they had, they might have seen the careful drawings, the annotated graphs, the dreams inked into every page. But they didn't ask. No one ever did. The school itself didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't failing. She didn't demand attention or get into fights. She was simply present. Too quiet to be noticed, too brilliant to be nurtured in a system that rewarded sameness over spark. A guidance counselor once asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. When she answered an aerospace engineer, the counselor blinked, then said, "That's ambitious," with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That was the end of that conversation. But she never stopped working toward it. In the margins of her science books, she scribbled trajectories and propulsion formulas. In her backpack, tucked between notebooks, was a folded letter she read so many times the paper was soft. It was from a NASA mentorship program she had applied to in secret. No one knew she had spent weeks crafting the essay, that she had rewritten it 5 times by candlelight while the power was out again. No one knew how much she had cried the night the envelope arrived in the mail, bearing the NASA logo. No one at school knew anything at all, yet. Every day in that third row, she listened as her peers talked over lectures, drew hearts in the corners of their papers, and passed notes. And every day, she took notes of her own, not just on physics and biology, but on how the world worked, on how people decided what was worth noticing and what they ignored, on how truth and brilliance were often hidden in silence. She knew, in that quiet way, certain only to those who have been underestimated, that her time would come. The whispers, the smirks, the sighs when she raised her hand, none of it would matter soon. Because one day, they would all look up and realize the girl in the third row had already launched. Curiosity had always been her constant companion, more loyal than any classmate, and far more forgiving than any teacher. It followed her through the cafeteria lines, where she counted the tiles on the floor just to calculate distance, and in the library corners, where she traced the lineage of space telescopes from Hubble to James Webb in a spiral notebook frayed at the edges. But curiosity for her had a cost. In a world where sameness was currency and loudness earned applause, quiet brilliance earned mockery. It began subtly, as these things often do. The sideways glances when she stayed after class to ask a question, the whispers behind hands when she corrected a lab formula under her breath. In group assignments, she was either ignored entirely or burdened with the whole project, as if her intelligence made her the class mule. When she turned in extra credit, some rolled their eyes. When she aced exams, some muttered, "Of course she did." And still, she pressed forward, not for them, but for herself. The science classroom became a strange battleground. Posters of Einstein and Curie adorned the walls, celebrating those who dared to think differently, yet inside those 4 walls, difference was quietly punished. Her questions were too deep, her connections too abstract. While others memorized formulas, she wanted to understand their origins. While the class parroted textbook definitions, she asked about what the book had left out. This hunger was not seen as ambition. It was seen as arrogance. Once, during a demonstration on magnetism, she suggested a different setup using superconductors. The teacher paused, confused, then offered a forced chuckle and dismissed her suggestion. A few boys in the back laughed louder than necessary. That laugh lingered longer than the lesson itself. It etched something into her that day, not pain, but a kind of resolution. If the world could not see her light, she would simply shine quietly until they had no choice. Even the way she dressed became a subject of scorn. Her clothing was always clean but never trendy, hand-me-downs stitched by care but not fashion. They whispered charity case when they thought she couldn't hear. Her backpack bore patches she had sewn herself to keep it from unraveling. That same bag carried her NASA papers, her schematics, her sketches for a prototype she hadn't yet built but saw clearly in her mind. None of them knew. None of them asked. There was an incident during biology lab that stuck with her more than the others. The class had been assigned to dissect frog specimens, an exercise that made most students squirm or squint with unease. She, however, approached it with precision and quiet awe, not out of morbid interest, but genuine fascination with structure, function, evolution. When she casually mentioned how amphibian respiration differed from mammalian systems, one student near her muttered, "She probably lives in a lab," followed by stifled giggles. Those words weren't cruel in volume, but they were sharp in intent. They weren't meant to be funny. They were meant to isolate. The teacher didn't say anything. No one ever did. She didn't respond. She never did. Instead, she focused on her work, making annotations in the margins of her lab report with a pencil worn down to the nub. Later that day, she copied them into her personal notebook, not because the grade required it, but because she couldn't bear to lose a single observation. In the hallways, they sometimes stepped in front of her accidentally or moved aside with exaggerated expressions, like her presence was somehow contaminating. On the bus, she was the last to be chosen for a seat partner, the first to be forgotten when teachers took attendance by memory. But her curiosity never wavered. It clung to her tightly, like a second skin, untouchable by ridicule. She had theories about sound waves, about particle collisions, even about light diffusion through human skin under ultraviolet exposure. She kept them tucked away in a folder labeled "Someday," and she promised herself that someday she would test them all. Until then, she studied in silence and endured the noise of those who could not see beyond what was visible. Even her kindness was seen as strange. Once she offered to help a struggling classmate with math. The girl smiled and accepted, but never showed up for the study session. Instead, she later heard that same girl say, "She probably thinks she's some genius or something." It wasn't just that they misunderstood her, it was that they resented what they refused to understand. She often wondered if her skin made it easier for them to ignore her. In her town, difference wasn't celebrated. It was endured. And when brilliance came wrapped in brown skin and quiet presence, it was labeled arrogance, or worse, invisibility. But her eyes stayed sharp. Her mind stayed lit. Every slight, every laugh, every raised eyebrow became another mental note. One afternoon during a physics lecture on orbital velocity, the teacher posed a question to the class. It was a simple prompt, intentionally designed to spark discussion. Why do satellites stay in orbit and not fall to Earth? A boy answered confidently, though incorrectly, something about gravity being weaker up high. The teacher nodded, encouraging the effort. Then her hand went up, slowly, reluctantly. The room grew quiet, not because they wanted to hear her, but because they wanted something to mock. She explained, clearly and concisely, how orbital velocity wasn't about escaping gravity, but falling around the Earth at just the right speed. She cited Newton, referenced vectors, and drew a diagram in the air with her hand. The teacher blinked, paused, and said, "That's one way to put it," before calling on someone else. The snickers came softly but immediately. Someone whispered, "NASA girl strikes again." That name should have made her proud. But in that room, it was a taunt. In the mirror of their laughter, her brilliance looked like alien speech. And yet that night, she stayed up writing a personal essay for a competition held by a local university. The prompt was about perseverance. She didn't have to reach far. The words flowed out like an open valve, not bitter, not angry, but steady and powerful. She wrote about standing out in rooms that demanded you stay small. She wrote about curiosity as armor, about science as survival. She didn't show anyone the letter she got weeks later. It came folded in thick paper with a university seal. They had chosen her essay as the winner. She would be honored at an event, one she wouldn't tell her classmates about. They didn't deserve to witness it. She didn't need them to clap. By then, she had already begun working on her own project at home, a small cube satellite design sketched in pencil on graph paper, circuits planned out with pieces she salvaged from broken calculators and an old DVD player. Her curiosity, mocked in class, bloomed in her room like fire under pressure. No one laughed there. No one stared. She had come to understand something most people never do. When others mock your curiosity, it's often because they fear your clarity. They don't hate the questions. They hate the reflection it forces in themselves. So she sat in the third row, taking notes that went beyond the syllabus, asking questions that reached past the classroom ceiling, dreaming with precision, and never waiting for applause. Because she knew the universe didn't laugh at her curiosity. It expanded to make room for it. The application began like most things in her life, in silence. No announcement, no cheers, no help. Just a line of text she read at the bottom of a page in the back of an old science magazine left in the library. NASA Summer Internship Program for High School Students. That one sentence was enough to still her breath. The letters seemed to float above the paper, glowing even under the dim flicker of the overhead lights. She read the eligibility requirements twice, then a third time as if expecting them to change, to slip away, to suddenly declare that a girl like her wasn't welcome. The library clock ticked its mechanical heart as she scribbled down the details in the margins of her notebook. The deadline was 3 weeks away. The requirements were rigid: a personal statement, a letter of recommendation, proof of academic excellence, and a project proposal. She had none of it yet, but she had something stronger than readiness. She had intent. After school, she walked straight home, her feet dragging slightly not from exhaustion but calculation. Every step was a thought, every breath a question. What would she propose? Who would write her a letter? Could she afford the postage if she had to mail the forms? Would her internet connection even hold long enough to upload the documents? Her household had no printer, no working scanner, no reliable power half the week, but she had persistence, and she had time if she started right now. She began with the personal statement. At first, the blank page mocked her. What could she say? That she was a girl they called weird, that she sat alone, that she had no club memberships, no polished trophies, no glowing references. But then she remembered the feeling in her chest when she saw the night sky through her telescope for the first time, how her breath caught at Saturn's rings, how she whispered the names of moons like lullabies to herself in the dark. And she wrote. She wrote not to impress, but to explain. She wrote about curiosity as inheritance, how questions had always been more present in her life than answers. She wrote about learning to solder circuits with a candle because they couldn't afford a proper iron, about using aluminum foil to build conductivity boards, about measuring room temperature with a repurposed kitchen thermometer, and graphing data by hand. Her words were simple, but they carried the density of truth, not rehearsed excellence, but lived experience. Each night after her homework, she returned to her application. She did not skip evenings, even when her mother returned home late and drained, even when the power blinked out mid-sentence and she had to write by flashlight. She borrowed a teacher's laptop during lunch under the pretense of catching up on an assignment. She used it to type her letter in a Google Doc and saved it at school because she couldn't trust anything at home to keep it safe. She knew that any moment, one surge, one outage, could erase it all. The letter of recommendation was harder. She wasn't close with any of her teachers. They saw her but didn't really see her. She asked her chemistry teacher carefully, nervously, holding out a handwritten sheet with details of the program. He read it over, nodded, said he would see what he could do. She didn't follow up. She didn't want to seem like she was asking too much. A week later, he handed her a sealed envelope and said, "Hope it helps?" She didn't know what was written inside. She just held it like it was oxygen. Her proposal, though, that was the part she lived for. She chose to write about low-cost satellite materials using recycled electronics. It wasn't something she had studied formally, but she had pages and pages of her own notes, drawings, experiments. Her mind poured itself into the document like it had been waiting for permission. She backed her concepts with basic physics, linked real-world examples, proposed a model she could build from components she already had. Her fingers trembled over the keyboard, not from fear, but anticipation. Submitting the application was its own journey. The school library's computers had spotty connections, and her time was limited to 20 minutes per student. She rehearsed each step in her head like a flight checklist. Log in, attach files, double-check spelling, click submit. She skipped lunch 2 days in a row just to be first in line at the library's front desk. Her backpack heavier than usual, with backup copies of every file saved on a borrowed USB stick wrapped in paper like it might break if exposed to air. When the moment came, the upload bar crawled forward like it was pushing against gravity itself. She didn't breathe until it said, submitted. Then she just sat there, eyes still on the screen, hands clenched in her lap. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of yes, not just hope, but belief. Not in the system, but in herself. For the next week, she checked her email every day, even though she knew the reply wouldn't come so soon. Every beep of her inbox felt like it could change her life. But mostly, there was silence. She didn't talk about it to anyone. Not her classmates, not her family. It felt like a fragile seed in winter, something that needed to be protected, not exposed. The only one who knew was her younger brother, who watched her open her notebook each night and whisper numbers into a calculator by candlelight. On a Thursday morning, while she was sharpening her pencil in homeroom, the intercom called her name. Her teacher looked confused. She stood, unsure. At the office, the school secretary handed her an envelope. No logo, just her name, typed in perfect serif font. She didn't open it until she was back in the library. There, under a shelf of outdated encyclopedias, she tore it gently at the top and unfolded the letter inside. She read the first sentence 3 times before it sank in. She had been selected for the NASA internship. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. Instead, something quiet settled inside her, a calm she'd never felt before. Not vindication, not triumph, just clarity. She folded the letter, tucked it between the pages of her notebook, and walked to class. No one noticed. No one knew. But she did, and that was more than enough. She carried the letter everywhere. Folded neatly into fourths, it rested in the front pocket of her backpack where she usually kept her calculator or an emergency granola bar. Its edges began to soften with time, the creases smoothing out slightly from the natural movement of her steps and the heat of her body. But she never replaced it, never laminated it. That roughness, the faint oil of her fingers that had touched it a dozen times a day, made it real, made it hers. She didn't show it to anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because the moment felt like it had to stay quiet, sacred. No one in her classroom would have understood. They would have stared blankly at the words accepted and NASA and blinked as if she were reading from a fantasy novel. And maybe it was. Maybe for a girl like her, that kind of opportunity did feel like fiction. But it wasn't. It was paper and ink and promise, a bridge between the smallness she endured and the greatness she knew waited beyond. Every afternoon after school, she would take a longer way home, a route that curved near the edge of town and past a worn-down library with satellite dishes that hadn't worked in years. There was a bench behind the building where nobody ever sat, and it became her ritual to pause there, open the letter again, and reread it. Not because she forgot the words, but because each time she read them, they sounded new. The phrasing of the acceptance was formal, almost sterile. "We are pleased to inform you." Yet in her mind, those 5 words lit up like constellations. We are pleased. They were pleased. With her. The girl who wore the same jacket every day. The girl they called too quiet, too weird, too smart. She wondered how many others had received this same letter. She wondered how many of them would be white, well-funded, celebrated. But even if she was the only one like her in that room, she would still belong. She began to prepare, not with excitement, but with meticulous care. She reread every instruction in the follow-up email from the program coordinator. It included things she'd never had to think about before: transportation, clothing for a lab environment, a laptop. They assumed every accepted student had these things. She didn't. Her family didn't own a suitcase, only a duffel bag with one broken strap and faded corners. They had no credit card to secure travel bookings, no car to get her to the city where the shuttle would leave. But instead of panicking, she did what she always did. She started a list. She walked 3 blocks to the church food pantry, not for food this time, but to ask if they had a spare backpack or a pair of shoes that weren't scuffed beyond repair. The volunteer coordinator, a tired woman with sharp eyes, handed her a bag filled with odds and ends and said she could keep whatever fit. Inside, she found a black canvas messenger bag, slightly frayed but functional, and a pair of nearly new sneakers in her size. It felt like the world was answering her piece by piece. At home, she spread the letter on her bed and placed the essentials around it. Her notebook, her soldering iron, the solar cell she'd dismantled from a garden lamp, a plastic model of the Mars rover she'd built from Lego 2 years ago. It wasn't that she thought she'd need these things at the internship, it was that they reminded her of who she was. That this wasn't luck, it wasn't pity, it was earned. Still, she didn't speak of it. Not in school, not to her classmates. Even when they continued to tease her, even when one of them knocked her notebook off the desk and whispered, "You still dreaming of space, freak?" She didn't say a word, because she didn't need their approval anymore. She had something they didn't. She had proof. The letter in her bag was louder than any insult. It was a full sentence written in the ink of her worth. The morning of her departure came quietly. The house was still asleep, the sky a soft gray that hadn't made up its mind about rain or light. She dressed in silence, folding the letter one last time and slipping it into the inside pocket of her jacket, where it rested over her heart. Her mother was already in the kitchen, sipping tea from a cracked mug, and when their eyes met, no words passed between them, only a nod, tight and proud. Her mother didn't ask questions, didn't lecture, didn't cry. She just placed a banana and a folded $5 bill into her daughter's hand and whispered, "Be safe." Outside, the city hadn't noticed that one of its quietest girls was about to step into a world that rarely opened for kids like her. The bus that took her to the shuttle stop was half empty. She watched people board and exit as the city rolled by in shadows and reflections, unaware that in one small corner of that bus sat someone whose future had just bent in a new direction. She imagined her name on a badge, imagined her voice in a room where no one mocked her, imagined being asked questions she couldn't wait to answer. When she arrived at the shuttle pickup point, a man in a NASA windbreaker checked her name off a list. She half expected him to hesitate, to say there had been a mistake. But he didn't. He just said, "Welcome." That one word, "welcome," nearly undid her. She looked down at her shoes, the second-hand ones that still squeaked slightly on certain tiles, and for a moment, she stood frozen between two worlds, the one she came from and the one she was stepping into. On the ride to the facility, she sat by the window, the letter still close, the city shrinking behind her. She didn't need to read it anymore. She had memorized every word, but still, as the bus moved forward, she slipped a hand into her jacket and touched the fold of the paper, not to remind herself of where she was going, but to remember how far she had already come. The NASA facility felt nothing like school. It wasn't just the architecture, sleek lines, glass walls, and labs humming with quiet purpose. It was the air. It vibrated differently. It didn't buzz with judgment or boredom or laughter that stung. It pulsed with intent. Everyone here was focused. Everyone moved with a reason, spoke with weight, carried themselves like their ideas were valuable. For the first time, she felt like she was walking into a space that had been waiting for her, even if it hadn't known her name. The interns arrived from every corner of the country. Some came from private schools that offered engineering classes as electives, others from academies with 3D printers and robotics clubs and travel stipends. Their voices were confident, layered with experience and entitlement. Some carried laptops with stickered logos from Ivy League summer camps. She arrived with her second-hand messenger bag, her beat-up notebook, and a single pen that never left her grip. But instead of shrinking, she observed. They were intelligent, no doubt, but many were used to being told they were. Their certainty came from repetition, from systems that had always told them they belonged. She had never been told that. She had to build that knowledge brick by brick in silence against resistance. And that made her different, not lesser. Different like a star whose light took longer to arrive because it had started farther away. On the second day, they were divided into teams. Each would be assigned a mentor and given a problem to solve. something real, drawn from current research. Her team had 4 members: herself, a boy named Colin who never stopped talking, a girl from Miami who typed with alarming speed, and a shy student who only spoke when absolutely necessary. Their project was deceptively simple: design a lightweight sensor array for monitoring atmospheric conditions on small satellites. Deadline: 10 days. At first, the dynamic was exactly what she had expected. Colin dominated the conversation, listing off ideas he had read about in journals, cutting off others mid-thought, confident in his technical vocabulary. The girl from Miami followed suit, not unkindly, but with a kind of impatient efficiency that left no room for hesitation. The quiet boy scribbled in his notebook, offering nods and half-finished sentences. And her? She waited. She listened. She wrote everything down, not just the ideas, but the gaps between them. By the end of the first brainstorming session, they had a list of components, a vague diagram, and a plan to delegate tasks. She was assigned basic research. It felt like a courtesy role, low risk, unlikely to affect the main structure. She accepted it with a nod and went back to her dorm that night with her brain on fire. She didn't sleep. She studied. She dug through white papers, journal articles, decommissioned patent databases. She built a mini sensor sketch using only a borrowed microcontroller simulator and a spreadsheet. The next morning, she came to the table with something none of them expected: a model. She unrolled a hand-drawn schematic and walked them through it with quiet precision. A modular design that used recycled copper from defunct USB cables, reducing weight and cost. She explained how the sensor array could piggyback off thermal regulation systems already embedded in the satellite, eliminating redundancy. They stared. Colin blinked. Miami girl leaned closer. The quiet one said, "That's actually brilliant." From that point, something shifted. Slowly but undeniably. They started listening, asking, including. She wasn't louder, but she was firmer. Her voice had weight now, not because it had changed, but because they'd learned to hear it. She led 2 more design iterations, negotiated with a software mentor for access to prototype code, and corrected a math error in Colin's voltage regulator formula without apology. By the 7th day, her team had something tangible, a prototype that worked. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but impressively. It responded to environmental variables in real time, logged data efficiently, and weighed less than the required threshold by nearly 12%. During the internal review, their mentor asked one question: who led the circuitry design? No one hesitated. They all pointed to her. The final presentation was held in the auditorium, a space much larger and colder than she expected, with tall glass panels and a projector screen wider than her classroom wall back home. Rows of engineers, program leads, even visiting scientists sat with clipboards and serious expressions. Each team was given 12 minutes. She stood behind the podium when their turn came, palms flat on the wood, her letter folded in the lining of her jacket like a talisman. When she began to speak, her voice didn't waver. She didn't look down at notes. She knew every measurement, every trade-off, every late-night fix. She explained their failures before the judges could ask about them. She didn't dress them up. She owned them, because failure was part of her fluency, too. It was part of how she had learned. After the last slide faded, there was silence, then a single clap, then more. One of the judges, a woman with a gray bun and a name she recognized from journal articles, stood and said, "That's the most efficient use of passive thermal design I've seen in a student project." She nodded. Not with arrogance, with recognition. That night, her team celebrated. Colin offered a fist bump. Miami girl asked her to review a resume draft. The quiet boy simply said, "I'm glad you were on our side." But she didn't stay long. She slipped out to the edge of the complex, where the artificial lights thinned and stars began to show themselves. She looked up, not to dream, but to calculate, to imagine, to plan. She wasn't chasing space anymore. She was building the path to it, and somewhere, tucked deep in her coat, the letter remained, not as proof, but as reminder. The stage was never theirs to give. It had always been hers to take. The early morning at the facility began without ceremony, but to her it felt like the breath before a launch. The labs were still dim, with sunbeams pushing through blinds and glinting off aluminum casings and glass instruments. While others were still asleep or packing to leave, she had already dressed, packed her notes, and returned to the research wing. Her badge beeped quietly at the door scanner. She entered not like a visitor anymore, but like someone expected. The air inside the building was crisp and cool, conditioned precisely to preserve equipment and data integrity. She walked past project boards, complex timelines, stacks of tagged components waiting to be reviewed. The hum of cooling fans from the supercomputer lab greeted her like a friend. She took a seat at one of the workstations and pulled up the files Dr. Minari had given her. It wasn't an assignment on paper. It was a quiet signal of trust. Unfinished telemetry logs, strange readings from a Martian probe, and no context beyond a date and a time code. That was all she needed. She combed through the files methodically. Data wasn't just information, it was a language. And like any language, it had tone, rhythm, silence. By the second hour, she had marked irregular voltage surges in 3 separate entries. By the third, she mapped those readings against internal system latency, noting a pattern the previous team had dismissed as error noise. But it wasn't noise. It was a warning the system had failed to escalate. She drafted a note and walked it upstairs. Dr. Minari read her findings in silence, then nodded, then called another engineer over. A second opinion confirmed her analysis. No one said good job or clapped. They invited her into the diagnostics room. By noon, she was wearing a visitor's coat, standing in front of a live monitor from a lunar satellite feed. A technician explained the interface, not like a superior, but like a colleague. She asked one question, and it led to a half-hour discussion about data lag between interdependent modules. She offered a solution using redundant pulse triggers from a prior paper she had read at midnight 3 days ago. The technician paused and said, "We've never tried that." And they did. It worked. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She had simply crossed an invisible line between student and contributor, and now every moment felt like a confirmation. The staff began to greet her by name. One even passed her a copy of a restricted white paper and said, "You might appreciate the modeling in Section 4. She did. She annotated it that night and returned it with marginal notes and a polite correction to one of the appendices. The engineer smiled and said, "We'll update the record." When the official internship closing event came, she sat quietly at the back. The others posed for photos, exchanged social media, and took turns signing each other's program t-shirts with inside jokes and acronyms. She accepted the commemorative certificate and NASA patch, but her heart wasn't in the ceremony. Her mind was still on the interface she'd helped fix, the dormant pattern she was sure still hid in the drone logs. She didn't want a frame for the wall. She wanted a login. Later, as buses lined up to return participants to the airport, Dr. Minari met her outside the main entrance. She handed her a plain white envelope. Inside was an invitation to the Junior Systems Fellowship, a program that paired high school students with mission engineers for remote mentorship across 6 months. No more mock tests, no more simulations. It meant real access to system builds, weekly challenges, even reviews of code implemented on live support systems. She boarded the bus without speaking much. She sat near the front alone, her bag under the seat and her fingers curled tightly around the envelope. She looked out the window not to say goodbye, but to track the details. How the sunlight hit the compound's roof, how the buildings were clustered, how many steps from the lab to the west gate. She was not a visitor in that memory. She was already writing the coordinates of her return. When school resumed that fall, she walked through the halls with the quiet weight of someone who had seen something vast. The petty ridicule bounced off her. She was back in the 3rd row of science class, same seat, same flickering bulb overhead. But her notebook now contained something different. Live system maps, diagnostic protocols, annotated excerpts from satellite telemetry. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't shrinking. She corrected her teacher during a lecture on thermal drift in vacuum environments, respectfully, clearly, no hesitation. The teacher paused, checked his notes, and nodded. "You're right." The class looked at her, but this time the whisper wasn't weird. It was, how did she know that? Her reputation began to shift, slowly at first, like a glacier finding its own weight. A classmate asked if she could help with a chemistry lab write-up. Another asked what books she read. The ones who had once laughed the loudest now found themselves unsure. She didn't gloat. She didn't correct out of ego. She shared what she knew because it made things clearer, and she was no longer afraid of clarity. One morning she found a note in her locker. No name. just a scrawl. "Are you really working with NASA?" She folded it in half and placed it in her backpack. She didn't need to answer. Each Friday evening, she logged into the secure server, the same one Dr. Minari had onboarded her into. Her username was a string of letters and numbers, not tied to her name, just her access. Her dashboard showed tasks, some labeled active, some pending. She completed them one by one, and when she had questions, she submitted notes. Engineers replied. Real engineers, not teachers, not simulations. People who made machines orbit the Earth. One weekend, her screen flashed with a priority flag. A test model she had written triggered a recursive loop warning. Her handler confirmed it and patched the protocol. That patch was then submitted to an actual satellite maintenance branch. It wouldn't go live right away, of course, but her logic, her script, her thought was now in line for implementation. It was real. She no longer viewed herself as someone reaching for the stars. She was part of the system that supported them. She walked differently. She studied differently. She dreamed wider, but also more precisely. Not what if, but how exactly. NASA wasn't just an acronym anymore. It was a language she could now speak, and it spoke back. That night, when the stars crept over her neighborhood, she stepped outside with her notebook, not to stargaze, not to wish, but to sketch a new configuration she'd been thinking about, a way to improve bandwidth communication between low-orbit arrays using feedback from thermal anomalies. She smiled, tapped the page twice, and whispered to the sky not a question but a promise. "I'm not done."